I never thought I'd see the day when someone would look at my private backyard pool and declare, "That's public property." Yet here I am dealing with an HOA led by a person, or rather, an entire board named Karen, who insists my pool belongs to the entire neighborhood. At first, I assumed it was just a weird misunderstanding, something we'd clear up over a friendly conversation. Little did I know I was stepping into a battle of epic proportions: phone calls, letters, threats of fines, and one persistent woman determined to treat my home like a community amenity. It all started on a warm afternoon when I was skimming leaves out of my pool, only to see an unfamiliar family strolling through my yard with beach towels. Confused, I politely asked what they were doing. They answered, "Karen said the HOA owns this pool now." Stunned, I realized this was no joke. The next day, I set out to prove my property boundaries, only to discover that wasn't nearly enough for Karen. And that's exactly how I came up with a plan. If they want my pool, they can have it. As a duck pond. After that bizarre encounter, I realized the stakes were a lot higher than just an annoying misunderstanding. If Karen and her HOA board really believed they had partial ownership of my pool, the consequences could be huge. Imagine random neighbors sauntering into your backyard at all hours, kids shrieking as they dive in without permission, and lawsuits springing up the moment someone scraped a knee on the pool deck. Worse yet, if a genuine accident occurred, like someone nearly drowning, it might become my legal nightmare. The idea that I would be liable for a so-called public amenity on my land was absolutely chilling. But it wasn't just about potential liability, there was also the emotional burden. I'd invested a lot of money and care into my home. This was my personal sanctuary, my place to unwind with family and friends. Seeing uninvited strangers in my yard, splashing around as if they owned the place, struck at the heart of my sense of privacy. I had read about HOAs overstepping boundaries before, but having them literally claim my property as their own? That was next-level audacity. If I didn't act, the line between private and public space would vanish. There would be no telling how many neighbors might show up unannounced, or how aggressive Karen would become if she felt I was resisting her so-called community obligation. A single oversight could turn into a permanent public access claim, and if you've ever faced a determined HOA, you know how stubborn they can be. This was not going to resolve itself through passivity. I had two choices: cave in and let Karen treat my backyard like a community water park, or stand up, draw a legal line in the sand, and reclaim my property. It was clear which option I'd pick. The question was how. After a night of tossing and turning, I decided that if Karen wanted to meddle, then the pool was coming out of commission, in the strangest way possible. I wasn't sure how the neighborhood would react, but I was about to find out. Let's rewind to the early days. Long before I ever thought of turning my pool into a duck haven. I bought this house a year ago, delighted by the spacious backyard. The property listing boasted an in-ground pool perfect for summer fun, and I remember thinking it was the highlight of my purchase. The house is in a quiet suburb, but ironically, it's overseen by an HOA called Karen. I'd been warned by the realtor that the board had a reputation for micromanaging trivial things like mailbox colors and garbage can placements. Still, I figured, how bad can it really be? For the first few months, everything was blissful. I lounged by the pool whenever I got a chance, invited friends over for pool parties, and sank money into pool maintenance so it would stay pristine. Since the backyard was fully fenced, I never worried about privacy. All that changed the day I found an envelope pinned to my front door, an envelope bearing the official Karen logo. Inside was a neatly typed letter requesting that I keep the pool gates unlocked for community enjoyment. I did a double take, sure I'd misread the words. Why in the world would I keep my pool gate unlocked for the public? I hopped onto the HOA's website, skimmed through their rules, and found nothing about personal pools being shared. Confident this was a mistake, I called the number listed on the letter. A crisp voice answered, "Karen HOA, how can I help you?" After explaining my confusion, the woman on the line insisted, "The board has decided it's in the community's best interest to have access to local pools." It became quickly apparent they wanted a personal, private amenity to become a communal water feature. My immediate reaction was disbelief, followed by a sense of violation. I politely declined. "I'm not comfortable with that, or it's my private pool." The response wasn't ominous. "We'll see about that." Feeling uneasy, I hung up and told myself that maybe they were just testing me or seeing if I'd fold easily. When no further letters or calls came for a few weeks, I hoped the matter was settled. Then, one afternoon, I came home from work to find a mother and her 2 kids in the backyard. Swimsuits on, towels draped over the fence, the gate propped open. Shocked, I asked what was going on. The mother looked equally surprised. Karen said the pool is available for all HOA members, she declared. I'm sorry, but I have every right to be here. As much as I wanted to be polite, my frustration surged. I explained the confusion, but she stood her ground, referencing a Facebook post from the HOA page that apparently listed my address as a community-friendly pool option. She even pulled out her phone to show me. And lo and behold, there was a post stating, members of the Karen HOA are entitled to use the following privately owned pool during daylight hours. My address, in plain text. I nearly lost. I escorted the mother and kids out, locked the fence, and immediately tried calling the HOA's main line. After half an hour of being redirected, I got voicemail. So, I wrote an email to the entire board, demanding they remove my address from their official communications, and clarifying that my pool was private. Within hours, I got a single-sentence reply, "You'll need to attend our next HOA meeting to discuss the matter. Sincerely, Karen." Furious, I realized they wanted to make it official, drag me into a meeting so they could push me around publicly. I wasn't about to go in unprepared. That weekend, I scoured the official HOA bylaws, my home purchase agreement, property surveys, and even local ordinances. Nowhere was there a clause suggesting the HOA had any right to claim my pool. I found several references to shared community amenities, like a tiny park and a clubhouse that the HOA truly owned. But private property rights were explicit. Each homeowner is responsible for their own yard, fences, and pools. Armed with this evidence, I went to the monthly meeting. It was held in a small conference room at the local library. I walked in, papers in hand, heart pounding. A half-dozen board members sat behind a long table, with Karen at the center, arms crossed, surveying the room. She had an air of authority I found unsettling. Once the meeting was called to order, I raised my hand and said I wanted to address the rumor that my pool was publicly accessible. Karen's eyes flicked to me with a dismissive look. "This is about community standards," she said. "We expect all residents to participate in fostering a welcoming environment." She then launched into an explanation of why the neighborhood needed more recreational spaces. "Since we don't have a large pool in our HOA area, your property is well situated to accommodate that need." I calmly explained that I was not part of any agreement to make my pool a public resource. I showed them the property lines, the deed, the bylaws. Karen's response? "We can't have a homeowner with a major recreational facility refusing to share. It's not in the spirit of our community." Several board members nodded in agreement, but I also spotted a few who looked uneasy with her stance. Nonetheless, Karen concluded, "We'll be sending you an official notice of mandatory compliance." The utter gall left me speechless. By the time I left that meeting, I was a bundle of nerves and anger. They genuinely believed they could strong-arm me into opening my property to random strangers. Or at least Karen believed she could. I knew I had to escalate on my end, maybe with a lawyer or some official complaint, but I also had an inkling that no simple cease and desist letter would shut them down. This was personal to Karen now, and she wasn't going to let it go easily. I felt cornered. It was more than a question of property lines. It was about setting a precedent. If the HOA could just declare my pool fair game, what else might they claim next time? Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the battle. They hadn't yet threatened fines or brought in city inspectors, and I hadn't yet discovered the radical solution that would turn my backyard from a pool into a whole different spectacle. A week after that tense HOA meeting, I started receiving letters almost daily. They had the official Karen HOA letterhead and a polite yet forceful tone. Essentially, each message demanded that I comply by allowing public access or face fines for failure to adhere to community recreational standards. The sums they threatened varied. Some letters said $50 a day. Others jumped straight to $100 a day after a grace period. None of them cited a bylaw number that actually matched my property. It looked more like intimidation than legitimate enforcement. My friends advised me to ignore the letters, but ignoring them didn't feel safe. Karen's repeated threats left me worried that if I didn't respond, they might escalate to placing a lien on my house or something equally extreme. So I typed up a formal rebuttal, attaching copies of the property deed, the local ordinances, and sections of the HOA bylaws that contradicted their claims. I ended with a statement that I would consider any further attempt to enforce public access to my pool as harassment. I expected that might calm the situation, but it only seemed to fuel Karen's zeal. I received a phone call, blocked number. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "I hope you realize you're making things difficult for everyone in the neighborhood. We will get legal backing." Then she hung up. I had no proof it was Karen, but it certainly sounded like her. My nerves were frayed. Was I about to be dragged into a lawsuit? Could an HOA genuinely twist the law to that extent? What took me by surprise was how the neighbors responded. Some approached me apologetically, explaining they'd heard rumors that my pool was open to the public, but they weren't sure if it was true. They told me they had no desire to intrude. Others, though, were more brazen, walking by my fence in broad daylight, peering over it, some even rattling the gate to see if it was locked. It was as if a portion of the neighborhood had collectively decided my yard was the new hotspot. One neighbor, Mr. Phillips, confided that Karen was hosting monthly OA gatherings, where she'd spin a story about how I was selfishly denying the community something that rightfully belonged to them. He said that many board members voiced support for me privately, but no one wanted to cross Karen publicly. She had a reputation for making life difficult if you ended up on her bad side. Hearing that was disheartening, but it also clarified that this wasn't about fairness or rules. It was about Karen's power trip. The idea to convert my pool into a duck pond came in a moment of exasperated humor. I was on a call with a friend, venting about how insane it was that people felt entitled to my water. My friend joked, "Why don't you fill the pool with fish or something so nobody wants to swim in it?" We both laughed. But that night, as I scrolled through local wildlife pages online, I stumbled upon a segment about rehabilitating ducks, and a light bulb went on. What if I changed the pool's purpose entirely? At first, it was just a silly concept, but then I realized that if I no longer had a swimming pool, the HOA's entire argument about shared recreational space would collapse. After all, the claim was based on me owning a functional water amenity. If it wasn't a pool anymore, but a private pond, wouldn't that bypass their nonsense? I started researching. Converting a pool to a pond, even a duck pond, wasn't entirely outlandish. People have done fish ponds, koi ponds, water gardens. The biggest challenges were filtration, water depth, and local regulations about aquatic habitats. But here's the kicker. Once classified as a decorative pond, it wouldn't be considered a swimming facility subject to typical pool-related rules. I got in touch with a local wildlife volunteer who gave me tips on building a safe environment for ducks. Before I made any drastic decisions, I wanted to double-check the legal angle. My backyard is enclosed, so the city's codes for decorative or agricultural ponds might apply. Sure enough, I found a clause that said a homeowner could maintain a small water feature for wildlife, as long as it didn't exceed certain dimensions or pose a risk to neighbors like flooding. My pool fell well within those guidelines. I smiled, imagining Karen's reaction once she realized she couldn't push me around if I no longer had a pool. But I wasn't naive. I braced for pushback. If I genuinely converted the pool, the water would get murky. My once lovely turquoise lagoon might turn into something less visually appealing. Could I handle that? It meant no more personal swims, no more pool parties. But at this point, the fight had become more about principle. If sacrificing my swimming pool was the price of shutting down the HOA's claim, so be it. And so, armed with a growing plan, I prepared for the biggest confrontation yet. Little did I know it would involve uproar at the next HOA meeting, several local news inquiries, and a dramatic standoff in my own backyard, complete with honking ducks. Let's just say, if Karen thought she could strong-arm me, she was in for a feathery surprise. The day I decided to go through with the transformation felt surreal. I drained most of the chlorinated water, had a professional come in to clean out the chemical residue, and then refilled the pool with fresh water. Next, I installed a basic pond filtration system more suited to fish and waterfowl than human swimmers. I added some plants along the edges, reed grasses, a few water lilies, and even small logs for ducks to perch on. Within a few days, my once sparkling pool started looking like a wildlife habitat in progress. I reached out to the local wildlife volunteer who'd offered guidance. She connected me with a small rescue group that rehabilitates injured ducks before releasing them back into the wild. They loved the idea of an enclosed space where ducks could recover safely. After some back and forth to ensure we had a proper environment, I prepared to welcome a handful of feathered guests. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, 4 ducks arrived, each with minor wing or foot injuries. Suddenly, my backyard was home to adorable quacking creatures who had zero interest in letting random people splash around. Word got around fast. Some neighbors peered through the fence slats, pointing at the floating ducks. Others seemed amused by the transformation. But Karen? She was livid. I discovered this when I heard furious pounding on my front door early one morning. Opening it, I found Karen in a crisp pantsuit, arms crossed, face red with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" she snapped, not even bothering with a hello. "We have a serious complaint from multiple residents that your pool is now some kind of pond?" "That's correct," I replied calmly. "This is no longer a swimming pool. It's a private duck pond. I'm working with a local wildlife rescue to rehabilitate these ducks. They'll eventually be set free, but for now, this is their safe habitat." Karen looked like she wanted to explode. "You can't just do that. The HOA already designated your pool as a community recreational space. You can't unilaterally change it to ... His nonsense." I took a breath, reminding myself to stay composed. "You yourself claimed this was a major recreational facility that needed to follow the HOA's rules. But it's no longer a pool, so those rules no longer apply. If the bylaws state otherwise, please show me exactly where." I was fully prepared, having reread every line of the HOA documents. She had nothing to stand on. Threatening to bring the matter up at the next board meeting, Karen stormed off. I closed the door, somewhat shaken but feeling an odd sense of triumph. For once, Karen didn't seem to know what to do. A few days later, a local community blogger, someone I'd never met, sent me a direct message online. They wanted to interview me about the HOA drama regarding a newly formed duck pond. Apparently, one of my more supportive neighbors had posted about the conflict on social media, labeling it Pool versus Pond, the Karen HOA saga. People were intrigued. I hesitated at first, uncertain if going public would escalate tensions. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized shining a spotlight on the HOA's overreach could protect me if they tried any underhanded tactics. So I agreed to talk. The blogger came over, took some photos of the ducks paddling around happily, and asked me to recount the entire ordeal. From the moment the HOA declared my pool public property to my decision to convert it into a pond, my story was posted online with the headline, "Homeowner Fights Back, Turns Pool into Duck Haven to Thwart HOA Claims." The post went semi-viral in the local area. Comments ranged from supportive cheers to jokes like, "I'd pay to see Karen's face right now." A few folks questioned whether it was legal or safe to keep ducks in a suburban backyard, but I responded, explaining I had all the necessary approvals and that the pond was enclosed. The more attention the story got, the more it seemed to hamper the HOA's attempts to quietly bully me. No one wants to look like a villain harassing rehabilitating ducks. Of course, Karen wouldn't let the matter rest. She convened an emergency HOA board meeting citing violation of community standards. This time I was determined not to go alone. I brought a friend who knew real estate law fairly well. The meeting was packed. Word had spread about the fiasco, and neighbors both curious and supportive filled the chairs. Karen banged a gavel, calling the meeting to order. She launched into a tirade, claiming I was deliberately undermining the harmony of our neighborhood. She recited some vague references to home aesthetics, health concerns, and the original intention behind the pool. But she never mentioned any actual bylaw that was being violated. When it was my turn, I presented a concise argument. The structure in my backyard is no longer a swimming pool. There's no clause in the bylaws that prohibits decorative ponds or wildlife rescue collaborations. If the HOA wanted to treat my original pool as communal property, that was an overreach to begin with, and I was well within my rights to repurpose my backyard. Karen tried to counter, referencing some rule about external changes needing board approval, but I had already discovered that only structural modifications visible from the street required board oversight. My backyard was fenced, and the pond wasn't visible unless you trespassed. Plus, my real estate savvy friend chimed in, quoting a line about the HOA having no authority over permanent architectural changes that remain within code. The board members looked uneasy. One or two valiantly tried to back Karen's stance, but it was a losing argument. Finally, Karen declared, "We will be conducting further inspections. This matter isn't closed." She gave me a glare that could wither a plant, but as I surveyed the room, I noticed the crowd was not on her side. A handful of folks applauded when I finished speaking. I realized that public opinion was in my favor, the underdog homeowner protecting wildlife against an overbearing HOA. Walking out of that meeting, I felt emboldened. I had turned a desperate last-ditch idea into a full-blown project that neutralized the HOA's claims. Little did I know, Karen still had a few more letters to send, but the tide had shifted. The new duck pond was here to stay, at least until every last waterfowl was healthy enough to be released. And if Karen thought she could keep pushing me around after all this, she was about to find out just how resilient one determined homeowner could be. Looking back, I never would have guessed I'd lose a pool and gain a flock of rehabilitating ducks. Yet, despite the unexpected turn, It's been surprisingly rewarding. Not only did I stand my ground against the HOA's outlandish claims, but I also got to participate in a good cause, helping injured birds recover. In many ways, the entire experience taught me a valuable lesson. When you're backed into a corner by unreasonable demands, sometimes the wildest idea is your best defense. Today, the ducks are thriving. The water, while no longer crystal blue, is now a lively habitat filled with aquatic plants. And the best part? Not a single uninvited swimmer has attempted to leap into the pond. The initial chaos has given way to a calm acceptance. Even some of the neighbors who once tried to barge in for a free swim have come around, either by offering donations to the wildlife rescue or simply respecting my property lines. As for Karen, she's strangely quiet these days. I still see occasional letters from the HOA, but they're mostly generic reminders about lawn maintenance or trash day. It's clear that my high-profile stand, plus the local attention it garnered, made the board think twice about pushing me any further. If they do try, I have a new mantra: ducks before drama. So here's my advice for anyone dealing with an overreaching HOA. Know your rights, do your research, and if all else fails, think creatively. A well-timed, unorthodox solution can undercut even the most persistent attempts at intimidation. You don't always have to fight on their terms. Sometimes you can sidestep the fight entirely by changing the game itself. Thank you for hearing my story. If you're facing a similar battle, remember that you have more options than you might realize. Whether it's converting a pool into a duck pond or finding another inventive workaround, keep your sense of humor and your determination. Because in the end, a community is only as strong as the respect its members show each other, and we all deserve to feel safe and protected on our own property.